Dan had always cherished the solitude of his grandfather's lakeside property. Nestled at the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood, it was a haven of peace surrounded by tall pines and mirrored waters, untouched by the ever-encroaching reach of suburban development. This property had been in his family for generations, a slice of nature untainted by the conformity of manicured lawns and cookie-cutter homes. It was his sanctuary, a place where the world's noise quieted and the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of the lake against its shores. The neighborhood nearby was a different world entirely. Governed by a notoriously controlling homeowners association, it was the embodiment of suburbia's most overbearing tendencies. Every lawn was trimmed to identical lengths, every mailbox adhered to strict guidelines, and every resident knew better than to cross Karen Davenport, the Homeowners Association president. Karen was a woman in her early 50s with an iron grip on the neighborhood and a personality as rigid as the Homeowner Association rulebook she seemed to carry everywhere. Dan had heard stories about her, the fines for Christmas lights left up a day too long, the turf wars over parking spots. But he had always been thankful that his property lay just outside the Homeowner Association's boundaries. He was free from their rules, or so he thought. It started on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday morning. Dan was sitting on his porch, sipping coffee and enjoying the cool breeze when he noticed a figure walking up his driveway. It was Karen. Her sharp bob haircut and pressed blazer gave her an air of authority she didn't deserve, and she carried a clipboard like a weapon. Dan sighed. He had seen her patrolling the neighborhood before, but had never expected her to set foot on his property. Setting his mug down, he stood to greet her. "Good morning," Karen's overly cheerful voice carried the saccharine tone of someone who wasn't used to hearing the word no. She extended a hand, which Dan shook reluctantly. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" Karen's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I'm sure you've noticed that your property is a bit of an anomaly around here. It's such a lovely spot, and the lake is just gorgeous. It's a shame that it's not being utilized to its full potential." Dan raised an eyebrow. "It's utilized just fine for my needs." Karen chuckled as though he'd made a joke. Of course. But you see, the Homeowner Association Board has been discussing ways to enhance our community amenities, and we thought your lake would be a perfect addition." Dan's stomach sank. "My lake?" he repeated, his voice sharpening. "It's private property." Karen waved a dismissive hand, as though such details were trivial. "Oh, we're well aware. But think of it this way. By opening up the lake for community events, you'd be fostering a spirit of togetherness. Imagine the neighborhood kids enjoying a summer fishing derby or families gathering for a 4th of July picnic. It would be wonderful for everyone." Dan stared at her, incredulous. "I'm not a member of the Homeowner Association," he said firmly. "This property has nothing to do with your community." Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Well, technically that's true," she admitted, "but we're all neighbors here, and it's about the greater good, isn't it? Besides, we could handle all the logistics. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. All we'd need is your permission." "And what happens if I say no?" Dan asked, folding his arms. Karen's expression hardened ever so slightly. "Oh, I'm sure you wouldn't want to alienate yourself from the community. It's always better to cooperate. After all, property values are affected by how well we all work together." Dan felt a flicker of anger. There it was, the thinly veiled threat. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I appreciate your interest, but the answer is no. This property has been in my family for years, and I intend to keep it private." Karen's smile turned icy. "Well, that's unfortunate," she said, her tone clipped. "I had hoped you'd see the benefits of being part of something bigger, but if that's how you feel—" "It is," Dan interrupted. "Thank you for stopping by." Karen hesitated, as though she wasn't used to being dismissed so abruptly. Finally, she gave a tight nod. "Very well. Have a good day, Dan." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Dan watched her go, unease settling in his chest. He had a feeling this wasn't the last he'd see of Karen Davenport. The days that followed were uneventful at first. Dan went about his usual routine, enjoying his peaceful mornings by the lake and working on the cabin repairs his grandfather had left unfinished. But the sense of unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's visit had been more than a casual proposal. Sure enough, his suspicions were confirmed a week later when he found a letter taped to his front door. The letter was written on official homeowner association stationery, complete with the organization's logo at the top. It began with a condescending preamble about community spirit before launching into a list of reasons why Dan should reconsider his decision. The lake, it claimed, was a natural resource that would benefit everyone in the neighborhood. It even suggested that his refusal could be seen as a lack of goodwill toward his neighbors. At the bottom of the letter, Karen's signature loomed like a stamp of authority. Dan crumpled the letter in frustration. He wasn't part of the homeowner association. They had no jurisdiction over him or his property, yet here they were, trying to pressure him into compliance. It was infuriating. Determined not to be intimidated, Dan ignored the letter and went about his business. But Karen wasn't one to take no for an answer. Over the next few weeks, the pressure campaign intensified. Flyers began appearing on his property, advertising hypothetical community events at Lake Davenport. Dan found one taped to his mailbox, another pinned to a tree near the water's edge. Each one was more presumptuous than the last, detailing events like paddle boat races and outdoor movie nights. It was as though Karen had already claimed the lake as homeowner association property. The final straw came when Dan discovered a group of homeowner association members standing on the edge of his lake, discussing plans for a new dock. They hadn't even bothered to ask his permission. Furious, he stormed down to confront them, demanding to know what they were doing on his property. Karen, who was leading the group, met his anger with her usual condescension. "We're just exploring possibilities," she said smoothly. "No decisions have been made." "This isn't a negotiation," Dan snapped. "This is my land, and you have no right to be here." Karen's smile didn't waver, but the steel in her eyes was unmistakable. "You might want to reconsider your stance, Dan," she said. "After all, we're only trying to help the community." Dan clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. He had tried to be polite, but Karen had crossed the line. It was clear she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. But Dan wasn't about to back down. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him, least of all Karen Davenport. The pressure campaign began subtly, almost like an irritating hum in the background of Dan's otherwise quiet life. At first, it was easy to dismiss Karen's antics as harmless overreach. A few condescending letters, some passive-aggressive flyers, and the occasional icy glance from homeowner association members driving by his property. Dan told himself that if he simply ignored her, she'd move on to another target. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go, and her efforts soon escalated from mild annoyances to a full-scale campaign to break his resolve. One morning, Dan woke up to find a neatly folded letter slipped under his front door. The envelope bore the homeowner association's emblem, and the letter inside was printed on the same official stationery as the one he had crumpled and discarded weeks earlier. This time, the tone was more formal, almost legalistic. The letter claimed that the homeowner association had discovered old documentation suggesting that the lake might fall under the shared use clause of a long-defunct community covenant. It was vague and full of legal jargon, but the implication was clear. Karen and the homeowner association were laying the groundwork for a claim on his property. Dan felt a pang of anxiety as he reread the letter. He knew his grandfather had meticulously maintained records of the property's ownership, and he was confident that no such covenant existed. But the letter served its purpose. It planted a seed of doubt. Could the homeowner association find a loophole, some obscure technicality that would allow them to encroach on his land? He decided to consult a lawyer, just to be safe. Meanwhile, Karen's efforts continued to grow bolder. Flyers advertising hypothetical community events at the lake were now being distributed door to door throughout the neighborhood. The events were described in absurdly specific detail: fishing tournaments, paddleboat rentals, even a proposed lakefront movie night complete with a floating screen. The flyers made no mention of Dan or the fact that the lake was private property. Instead, they treated the lake as though it were already a public amenity, a fait accompli that Dan had no power to contest. The boldness of it all left Dan both angry and bewildered. He couldn't understand how Karen thought she could simply will his property into becoming part of the homeowner association. It wasn't just overreach, it was a complete disregard for his rights as a landowner. He started keeping the flyers as evidence, filing them away alongside the letters and other correspondence from the homeowner association. If this ever turned into a legal battle, he wanted to be prepared. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to take notice of the brewing conflict. Some residents quietly expressed their support for Dan, agreeing that Karen had gone too far. Others, particularly the die-hard homeowner association loyalists, sided with Karen and began parroting her talking points about community spirit and property values. Dan overheard snippets of conversation at the local grocery store and hardware shop, whispers about his supposed selfishness, rumors that he was planning to sell the property to developers, and even accusations that he was intentionally withholding the lake out of spite. The whispers turned into open hostility one Saturday afternoon when Dan returned home to find a group of homeowner association members gathered near the lake's edge. They were standing in a loose circle, gesturing animatedly as they discussed something Dan couldn't hear. Several of them were holding clipboards, and one man was taking photos with his phone. Furious, Dan marched down to confront them. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the crisp autumn air. The group turned to face him, their expressions ranging from sheepish to defiant. Karen, of course, was among them, her ever-present clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. "Good afternoon, Dan," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "We're just conducting a preliminary survey. No need to be alarmed." "On my property?" Dan shot back. "Without my permission?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "This is for the benefit of the entire community," she said. "We're exploring potential improvements that could enhance property values for everyone. It's in everyone's best interest, including yours." Dan took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "You have no right to be here, and you damn well know it. Get off my property. Now." Karen's expression hardened. "Dan, there's no need to be confrontational," she said. "We're trying to work with you, but your hostility is making it difficult." "I'm not hostile," Dan said through gritted teeth. "I'm protecting what's mine. Now, leave." The group hesitated, looking to Karen for guidance. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, she signaled for them to pack up. "Fine," she said. "We'll leave for now. But this isn't over." Dan watched as they retreated, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and unease. He knew Karen meant what she said. This wasn't over. If anything, the encounter had only emboldened her. Sure enough, the next day brought another escalation. Dan woke up to the sound of a truck idling in his driveway. He threw on a jacket and rushed outside, only to find a crew unloading materials near the lake. Wooden planks, nails, and other supplies were being stacked on the ground, and a small sign had been planted nearby that read, "Future Site of Homeowner Association Community Dock." Dan's blood boiled. He marched over to the crew and demanded to know who had authorized the construction. The foreman, a gruff man in his 50s, shrugged and gestured toward Karen, who was standing nearby, supervising the operation. "This is private property," Dan shouted as he approached her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned to face him, her expression calm but smug. "The homeowner association has every right to make improvements for the benefit of the community," she said. "This dock will be a wonderful addition." "Over my dead body," Dan snapped. "I'm calling the police." Karen's smugness faltered, but only for a moment. "You do that," she said, crossing her arms. "But I think you'll find that we're well within our rights." Dan didn't waste another second. He stormed back to his house and called the local sheriff's office. When the deputies arrived, Karen tried to spin the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming that the homeowner association had permission to begin construction. But when Dan produced the property deed and other documentation, it became clear that she had overstepped her bounds. The deputies ordered the crew to cease work immediately and warned Karen that any further attempts to trespass on Dan's property could result in criminal charges. She tried to argue, but it was no use. For the first time, Dan saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. As the crew packed up and left, Dan felt a small sense of victory, but he knew Karen wasn't finished. This was a woman who thrived on control, and she wasn't going to let go of her campaign that easily. If anything, the confrontation had only escalated the stakes. Dan braced himself for whatever came next, determined to protect his home and his lake from Karen's relentless overreach. The aftermath of the construction crew incident left Dan with a mixture of relief and apprehension. While the deputies had put an end to the immediate trespassing, he knew Karen wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. If anything, the confrontation seemed to fuel her resolve, and Dan could feel the storm brewing. She was a woman used to getting her way, and the idea of a non-compliant neighbor standing in her path was an affront she wouldn't tolerate. A week passed without incident, but the silence was far from comforting. Dan felt as if he were living under a magnifying glass, every move scrutinized by Karen and her loyal band of homeowner association followers. Every time he stepped outside, he noticed unfamiliar cars idling nearby or neighbors walking their dogs a little too slowly past his property. It wasn't paranoia. Karen was clearly orchestrating some kind of campaign, and it was only a matter of time before her next move. One morning, Dan awoke to find a new letter taped to his front door. The envelope was thicker this time, containing several folded pages of what appeared to be legal documents. The letterhead was the homeowner association's standard stationery, but the language was markedly different, cold, clinical, and threatening. It was a cease and desist letter, accusing Dan of obstructing community development and illegally denying access to shared resources. The letter claimed that the homeowner association had uncovered historical documentation proving that the lake had been designated as a community asset decades ago. It demanded that Dan immediately cease his interference and allow the homeowner association to proceed with their plans, or they would pursue legal action. Dan's hands shook as he read the letter. He knew it was complete nonsense. His grandfather had been meticulous about safeguarding the property's private status, but the sheer audacity of the claim left him rattled. The thought of facing a legal battle with the homeowner association was daunting, especially since Karen seemed more than willing to twist the truth to suit her. Determined to fight back, Dan called his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn who had a reputation for taking on homeowner association bullies. He scanned the letter and sent it to her for review, explaining the situation in detail. Evelyn called him back within an hour. "This is classic homeowner association intimidation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're trying to scare you into compliance. That letter has no legal basis. It's just a bunch of bluster, but we need to be proactive. I'll draft a formal response and put them on notice. If they want to escalate this, we'll be ready." Dan felt a surge of relief at her confidence, but he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his stomach. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate him. She was rallying the neighborhood against him, turning his peaceful lakeside retreat into a battleground. And as much as he hated to admit it, part of him feared she might succeed. The escalation came sooner than he expected. A few days later, Dan returned home from running errands to find a large banner strung across the entrance to his driveway. It read, "Community right over greed. Support homeowner association access to the lake." A small group of residents stood nearby, holding signs and handing out flyers to passing cars. Karen was, of course, at the center of it all, her clipboard in hand and a triumphant smile on her face. Dan parked his truck at the edge of the driveway and got out, his jaw clenched in frustration. As he approached the group, Karen stepped forward to meet him. "Good afternoon, Dan," she said, her tone dripping with faux politeness. We're here to raise awareness about an important community issue. I'm sure you understand." "Get off my property," Dan said, his voice low and steady. "Now." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Oh, we're not on your property," she said, gesturing to the edge of the driveway. "This is public land, and we're exercising our right to peaceful assembly. You can't stop us." Dan glanced at the crowd. Most of the residents avoided his gaze, their expressions ranging from embarrassed to defiant. He could tell that some of them had been coerced into participating, but that didn't make the situation any less infuriating. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Karen. "You've made your point," he said. "Now take down the banner and leave." Karen's smile widened. "I'm afraid we can't do that," she said. "The community has a right to be heard. If you're unwilling to cooperate, we'll have to continue our efforts to educate the public about the importance of shared resources." Dan's patience snapped. "This isn't about the community," he said, his voice rising. "This is about you trying to control something that doesn't belong to you. You don't have the right to come onto my property, harass me, or spread lies about me. I'm done playing nice, Karen. If you keep this up, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The crowd murmured uneasily, but Karen remained unfazed. "Do what you feel is necessary, Dan," she said. "But I think you'll find that the community isn't on your side." Dan turned on his heel and stormed back to his house, his heart pounding with anger. He grabbed his phone and called the sheriff's office, explaining the situation. The dispatcher assured him that deputies would be sent to disperse the crowd, but Dan knew it was only a temporary solution. Karen wouldn't stop until she was forced to. When the deputies arrived, they instructed the protesters to leave, citing noise complaints and concerns about traffic congestion. Karen argued, of course, but eventually she and her group packed up and left. Dan watched from his porch as the banner was taken down, but the victory felt hollow. The damage had already been done. Karen had succeeded in turning the neighborhood against him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she had more tricks up her sleeve. That night, Dan sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents and flyers. He felt overwhelmed and exhausted, but he knew he couldn't give up. Karen might have the neighborhood on her side, but he had the truth and the law on his. Taking a deep breath, he opened his laptop and began drafting a detailed timeline of events, documenting every interaction, letter, and incident. He didn't know what Karen's next move would be, but he was determined to be ready for it. As the hours ticked by, Dan's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about protecting his property. It was about standing up to a bully who had overstepped her bounds. Karen might have the homeowner association and a few loyal followers behind her, but Dan had something far more powerful, the courage to fight back. And he wasn't going to let her win. The fallout from Karen's protest lingered in the air like an oppressive storm cloud. Dan could feel the tension every time he stepped outside his house. Neighbors who had once waved or nodded in passing now avoided eye contact, and some even crossed the street to avoid him entirely. The whispers he overheard in town had grown louder, morphing into open hostility. Karen's campaign to paint him as the villain, the greedy outsider homeowner association arding a community resource, was clearly working, and Dan found himself feeling increasingly isolated. He tried to go about his daily life as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible to ignore the subtle and sometimes not so subtle acts of defiance from Karen and her followers. One morning he found a pile of trash dumped near the edge of his lake, complete with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Clean up your act, Dan." Another time, someone spray-painted "Greedy Neighbor" on the sidewalk near his driveway. Dan reported these incidents to the local authorities, but without evidence of who was responsible, there was little they could do. Karen, of course, denied any involvement. When Dan confronted her at a town hall meeting, she feigned shock and dismay, claiming that she had always encouraged her followers to express their concerns respectfully. Her words dripped with condescension, and her smug expression made it clear she was enjoying every moment of the chaos she had created. But Karen's most audacious move came a few weeks later, when Dan received an official notice from the homeowner association. The document claimed that his property, specifically the lake, was now subject to an emergency annexation under homeowner association jurisdiction. The annexation was supposedly justified by a clause in the homeowner association charter that allowed for the acquisition of private property deemed critical to community welfare. The notice demanded that Dan comply with homeowner association regulations, including granting access to the lake for approved community activities, or face escalating fines and legal action. Dan was furious. He immediately forwarded the notice to his lawyer, Evelyn, who called him within minutes of reading it. "This is absolute garbage," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "They can't just annex private property without due process. They're bluffing, Dan, trying to intimidate you into submission. But if they want to play dirty, we'll play smarter." Evelyn instructed Dan to gather every piece of documentation he had regarding the property's ownership, including the original deed, tax records, and any correspondence with the homeowner association. She also advised him to install security cameras around the lake and his property to document any future trespassing or vandalism. As Dan worked to compile the necessary documents, he couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and exhaustion. This battle with Karen and the homeowner association was consuming his life, turning what had once been his peaceful retreat into a source of constant stress. But every time he considered walking away, selling the property and leaving the neighborhood for good, he thought of his grandfather. The old man had poured his heart and soul into this land, building the cabin with his own hands and preserving the lake as a sanctuary for future generations. Dan couldn't let Karen take that away. The situation came to a head on a crisp Saturday morning. Dan woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside. He threw on a jacket and rushed out to find a construction crew assembling at the edge of the lake. Trucks loaded with materials and equipment were parked along the road, and a group of workers was unloading tools and lumber. Karen was there too, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a general commanding her troops. "What the hell is this?" Dan shouted as he approached the group. Karen turned to face him, her expression one of feigned surprise. "Oh, good morning, Dan," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "We're just beginning the preliminary work for the community dock. I assume you received the notice about the annexation?" "This is illegal, and you know it," Dan said, his voice tight with anger. "You have no right to be here." Karen's smile didn't falter. "On the contrary, we have every right. The homeowner association voted unanimously to approve the annexation. This is for the benefit of the entire community, Dan. You really should consider cooperating. It would make things much easier for everyone." Dan felt his blood boil. "You can't just vote to take someone's property," he said. "This isn't a dictatorship, Karen. Get your crew out of here before I call the sheriff." Karen's smile turned cold. "Feel free to call them," she said. "But I don't think you'll find much support for your position. The community is behind us, Dan. This is happening, whether you like it or not." Dan didn't bother arguing further. He stormed back to his house and called the sheriff's office, explaining the situation in detail. While waiting for deputies to arrive, he also called Evelyn, who immediately began drafting a cease and desist order. By the time the sheriff's deputies showed up, Dan was armed with documentation proving his ownership of the property and the illegitimate. The deputies ordered the construction crew to halt all activity and leave the property, warning Karen that any further attempts to trespass could result in criminal charges. Karen argued, of course, but the deputies were firm. They reminded her that the homeowner association's authority did not extend to private property and that any disputes would need to be settled in court. As the crew packed up and left, Karen shot Dan a venomous glare. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "This could have been so much easier." Dan didn't respond. He watched in silence as Karen and her followers retreated, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and triumph. He had won this round, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down, and her parting words felt like a promise of more trouble to come. That evening, Dan sat on his porch, staring out at the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. The water reflected the fiery hues of the sunset, a reminder of why he was fighting so hard to protect this place. It wasn't just about the property. It was about preserving the legacy his grandfather had entrusted to him. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Dan made a silent vow. No matter what Karen threw at him, he wouldn't give up. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he was determined to defend it at all costs. The tension between Dan and Karen had reached its breaking point. Days after the sheriff shut down the unauthorized construction at the lake, Karen had gone suspiciously quiet. Dan knew this wasn't a good sign. Karen didn't back down or give up. She regrouped, recalibrated, and came back twice as forceful. Dan felt the weight of her silence like an impending storm, and he couldn't shake the feeling that her next move would be her boldest yet. He wasn't wrong. One morning, Dan received an envelope in the mail. It was thick, stamped with an official legal seal, and addressed to him personally. Opening it, he found a lawsuit filed by the homeowner association against him, claiming that he had violated the common good of the community by denying access to the lake. The suit cited vague clauses about shared resources, public benefit, and community rights, all of which were clearly fabricated or misapplied. Karen and the homeowner association were demanding access to the lake, damages for emotional distress caused to the neighborhood, and reimbursement for the costs they had incurred during their unauthorized construction attempts. Dan felt his stomach drop. While he had been prepared for legal threats, an actual lawsuit was a different beast entirely. He immediately called his lawyer, Evelyn, who reviewed the documents with the sharp eye of a seasoned litigator. "This is complete nonsense," she said, though there was a hint of irritation in her voice. "They're throwing spaghetti at the wall hoping something sticks. But don't worry, Dan, we'll fight this, and we'll win." Evelyn quickly got to work, filing a counterclaim against the homeowner association for harassment, trespassing, and damages to Dan's property. She also filed a motion to dismiss their lawsuit on the grounds that it was frivolous and without merit. In the meantime, Dan prepared himself for what was sure to be a drawn-out and exhausting legal battle. While the case wound its way through the courts, Karen ramped up her smear campaign. Homeowner association members began circulating a petition, demanding that Dan comply with community standards or face further consequences. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, painting Dan as a greedy outsider who was holding the community hostage by refusing to share the lake. Some of the flyers even contained doctored photos of Dan's property, making it appear run down and unkempt to support Karen's narrative that he wasn't a responsible neighbor. Dan felt the weight of the hostility every time he left his house. Some neighbors openly glared at him, while others whispered behind his back. He received anonymous letters in the mail, some urging him to give in for the sake of the community, and others outright threatening him if he didn't. The isolation was suffocating, but Dan refused to let Karen and her cronies break him. Evelyn, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to gather evidence to dismantle the homeowner association's claims. She subpoenaed their financial records and internal communications, digging for anything that might expose Karen's true motives. What she found was more damning than either of them could have imagined. One evening, Evelyn called Dan with a breakthrough. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Karen's been using homeowner association funds to pay for all these stunts. The construction crew, the banners, even the legal fees for this ridiculous lawsuit. None of it was approved by the homeowner association board. She's been operating completely unilaterally." Dan was stunned. "So she's been using other people's money to fund her personal vendetta against me?" "Exactly," Evelyn confirmed. "And that's not all. It turns out she's been manipulating homeowner association elections to keep herself in power, bullying other board members into going along with her schemes, and misappropriating funds for personal expenses. This lawsuit is just the tip of the iceberg." Evelyn's discovery gave Dan the leverage he needed. Armed with evidence of Karen's misconduct, they prepared not only to defend against the lawsuit, but to expose her corruption to the entire community. The court date finally arrived, and Dan found himself sitting in a crowded courtroom, flanked by Evelyn and her legal team. On the other side of the room, Karen sat with her lawyer, looking as smug and confident as ever. The tension in the air was palpable as the judge entered and called the session to order. Evelyn wasted no time dismantling the homeowner association's case. She presented clear evidence that the lake was private property, owned outright by Dan and his family, and had never been part of the homeowner association's jurisdiction. She highlighted the numerous incidents of trespassing, harassment, and vandalism orchestrated by Karen, painting a picture of a coordinated campaign to intimidate and coerce Dan into compliance. But the real bombshell came when Evelyn presented the evidence of Karen's financial misconduct. She laid out the records showing how Karen had misused homeowner association funds, violated the organization's bylaws, and engaged in a pattern of corrupt behavior. The courtroom was silent as Evelyn delivered her closing argument, systematically dismantling Karen's credibility and exposing her true motives. When Karen took the stand, her composure began to crack. Under cross-examination, Evelyn cornered her with pointed questions about the financial records, the unauthorized construction, and her personal vendetta against Dan. Karen tried to deflect and deny, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the time Evelyn was finished, Karen's smug confidence had dissolved into barely concealed panic. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The homeowner association's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't bring the same claims against Dan again. The court also ruled in Dan's favor on his counterclaims, ordering the homeowner association to pay substantial damages for harassment and trespassing. But the final blow came when the judge recommended that the homeowner association conduct a full internal audit and that Karen stepped down as president immediately. As the gavel fell, Dan felt a wave of relief and vindication. He had won, not just for himself, but for the principle that bullies like Karen couldn't trample over others with impunity. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as Karen stormed out, her face red with humiliation. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. Karen was forced to resign from the homeowner association, and a new board was elected, one committed to transparency and fairness. Many neighbors who had sided with Karen apologized to Dan, admitting they had been misled by her lies. While Dan accepted their apologies, he kept his distance, wary of letting anyone get too close after everything he had been through. Life slowly returned to normal. Dan spent his days restoring his grandfather's cabin, fishing on the lake, and enjoying the peace and quiet he had fought so hard to protect. The flyers, the protests, and the lawsuits were a thing of the past, and the lake once again became a sanctuary, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. One evening, as the sun set over the water, Dan sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about his grandfather and the legacy he had left behind, a legacy Dan had defended against all odds. The lake shimmered in the fading light, a symbol of resilience and perseverance. Dan knew the battle had been worth it. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away.